Shalom, shalom aleinu. Shalom, shalom aleinu. Hello, 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 my holy sisters and brothers. How you doing? Wasn't that fun? That's Osa Shalom by the Moshav Band. How are you doing on this fine evening? What is it? Monday. Let's light up the darkness. I actually I had an eye exam today, and they dilated my pupils. It's not so bad looking at a candle. The light over there feels a little bright for me, but I'll do my best to muddle through. Who is with us on this lovely Monday? Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire, Pauline from Arkansas, Yehudit from Florence, Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey, Tom from Pennsylvania, Paula from Chicago, Stephanie from New York, Steiner from Delaware. Welcome, that's a new name. Pam says shalom from Nashville, friends. Not feeling the best, but didn't want to miss class. We honor you, Pam. Melissa from Great Neck. Nancy says, woo, I made it from Southern Pines, North Carolina. And Delana is with us from Lockhart, Texas. Welcome, everybody. Over on the YouTube side, Miracia is saying Shavua Tov, a good week to you. All right, let's get into it. I don't want to strain my eyes too much, but I'll do my best. It's like before I couldn't even read anything, but it was enough hours have passed that I can look at my notes and make them out, so it should be okay. All right, we've been discussing what happens when you have... So where are we? We are on Daf Ayin Zion. That's page 77 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 7, and today we're covering the second Mishna. Today's class is sponsored by Rosita Silvera in honor of Jim Silvera, and we thank you for that, Rosita. All right, let's get over into it. So we've been discussing what happens when there are two courtyards that neighbor each other. As we've seen, the last few chapters and 10, 20 pages have been all about. And so much of this tractate, right? If you've got multiple houses sharing a courtyard, the sages decreed in the time of King Solomon that you can't carry objects out of your house into a shared courtyard. If you have a single residence in a single courtyard, no problem. It's all the same private domain. But when you have a shared courtyard, two houses that share a courtyard, it has a bit of that sense of a semi-public area, and the sages said you can't carry stuff from your house into a shared courtyard or from the courtyard into the house on Shabbos. It's the same as you can't carry things from a private domain to a public domain, but you can fix it by making an eruv. The residents of the courtyard join in an eruv together. They all deposit food in a basket, store it in one of the houses, and then it's as if they're all one domain together, and they can carry stuff in and out of their houses to their courtyard. We also saw that courtyards can join together, but the requirement for courtyards joining together is that there's an opening between them. Yesterday we examined what are the requirements of that opening. It was really just a window. It had to basically be 4 by 4 handbreadths wide and have an area of 4 by 4 handbreadths, and that opening had to be within 10 handbreadths of the ground. If so, the residents would have the option to join together. They weren't required to join in an eruv together. They have the option. Or they could just make separate eruvs in their own courtyards, have the ability to carry from their houses into their respective courtyards, but not to carry objects on Shabbos that started inside one of their houses through a courtyard and then over into the other courtyard. Today, in the second Mishnah, we're going to look at the wall itself that separates the courtyards and ask the question, when is a wall not a wall? Because if a wall is not substantial enough, or if it's breached, if there's problems with the wall, then it's as if the wall isn't there. If you've got two courtyards that neighbor each other and have a wall between them, and then the wall isn't a wall, it's as if there's no wall between two courtyards, well, then what have you got? then you've got one big courtyard. If you had one courtyard with 4 houses in it, well, these 2 houses over there and those 2 houses over here cannot make a separate eruv to permit them to carry on, their part of their yard. Once you've got a single courtyard, all of the residents in the single courtyard have to participate in the eruv, or none of the people in those houses in anywhere in the courtyard are going to be permitted to carry objects in and out of their houses on Shabbos. So if you've got 2 courtyards and the wall between them turns out to not really be a wall, then you've only got one courtyard, and then you don't even have the possibility of that they have separate eruvs. They must all join in a joint eruv, as it were. So today we're going to be examining the wall. When is a wall not a wall? On a spiritual, sort of metaphoric level, which I like to introduce whenever possible, especially these days in our very polarized climate, where people have such divided, sentiments that they feel that, their view on issues is so different than other people that they don't even want to know from those people. Relationships are ending, even family relationships, God forbid, are being sundered by politics these days as people erect walls between them and people that they disagree with. And I think that the sages, I wouldn't say that it's overt that they were talking that some of these principles could be used on that kind of more metaphoric level about the impediments that people build between themselves and others, spiritual walls, as it were. But it's going to be pretty interesting when we keep, that more metaphoric level operating as we have this discussion about what its implications are. And let's keep that in mind. I'll try to bring it up and you'll see how it applies. All right, let's read our Mishna and then we'll get into the Gemaras that discuss it. The second Mishna of chapter 7 here in Tractate Eruvin. If a wall between 2 courtyards is 10 handbreadths high and 4 handbreadths wide, the residents of the courtyard establish 2 Eruvin, a separate one for each courtyard, and they may not establish 1 Eruv. So a wall that is at least 10 handbreadths high and 4 handbreadths wide, that's a pretty substantial wall, right? So something that's 4 handbreadths wide, right? So about this wide, that's a good thick wall. And 10 handbreadths off the ground, so a little bit more than waist high, depending on the person. So that's a pretty substantial wall. And what they're saying is it's a wall, it's at least 10 handbreadths high or more. It runs the whole length of the division between the 2 courtyards, and there's no opening in it. There's no doorway, there's no passageway. So that divides the 2 courtyards, and now they can't become one courtyard. They don't have the option to make a joint eruv. The idea that they could merge alleyways, if both of these courtyards have doors onto an alleyway, and that alleyway is more like a cul-de-sac, it's closed on 3 sides, okay, then they could do a different kind of joint eruv called a merger of alleyways, but that's not what we're discussing here. What we're talking about here is a joint eruv based on the fact that the 2 courtyards have a direct opening between them. This is a solid wall with no openings in it. It's at least 4 handbreadths wide and 10 handbreadths high. If so, they don't have the option to join together. They must make separate eruvin on either side of the wall. If there was produce on top of the wall, right, so we've got a little figure for you here, right? If there was literally produce on top of the wall between the 2 courtyards, and as you can see, each courtyard has to have multiple homes in it. That's part of the definition of a courtyard in these cases of eruv. So if there was produce on top of the wall, then these residents of one courtyard may ascend from this side and eat from it, and those residents of the other courtyard may ascend from that side and eat from it, provided that they do not lower the produce down from on top of the wall into one of the courtyards. So we're still assuming that this is a fence that's 4 handbreadths wide. Right, so if now, because it's 4 handbreadths wide, and it's obviously much longer than that, what the top of the fence is actually a separate domain. It is its own domain. Because it's more than 10 handbreadths off the ground level, because it's more than 4 handbreadths wide, and therefore it's more than 4 by 4, since it's much longer than that, the top of the wall is its own domain. And that's why the people could sort of climb up on the wall, sit on the wall, eat some food while they're on the wall. But they can't take the food off the wall into their own courtyard on Shabbos, because then they would have transferred food from a private domain to another domain, the courtyard, right, which is not the courtyard of the wall. And therefore, and since there's no eruv that's formed between the private domain, which is the top of the wall itself, and its courtyard to the side, that would be a prohibited transfer on Shabbos. Third paragraph of the Mishnah, if the wall was breached. So if the wall has a big hole in it, okay, the wall is not complete. Up until now, we've been talking about a complete wall that spans the whole distance between the two courtyards. But if the wall was breached, the following distinction applies. If the breach was up to 10 cubits wide, then they establish 2 eruvin, 1 on each side of the wall. And if they desire, they may establish 1 eruv, as it is similar to an entrance. The breach in the wall, the part of the wall that fell, if it's 10 cubits wide or less, right? If it's less than 10 cubits, then it's like there's a door. It's like an opening in the wall. And as we saw yesterday, okay, they have an entrance from one courtyard to the other. They don't have to form a joint eruv, but they have the option. It's permitted to form a joint eruv for the 2 courtyards to turn them into one. But if the breach was more than 10 cubits wide, they establish 1 eruv, and they may not establish 2. In other words, if more than 10 cubits of that wall has collapsed, the opening is so large that we don't think of it as an entrance anymore. We think of it as, these partial walls are meaningless. They now become insignificant because there's so much of an opening between the 2 courtyards that they're really one courtyard. And since it's one courtyard, all of the houses must participate in a single eruv for anyone in that now double courtyard, but it's really one courtyard, for anyone to carry in and out of their houses to the courtyard on Shabbos. Everyone must join in the single eruv to cover both spaces. That is the Mishnah. All right, so the first principle is that a wall must be 10 handbreadths high and 4 handbreadths wide to make separate eruvin, to make a separate eruv mandatory on each side of the wall. On that more metaphoric level, when is a wall a wall? When it's a significant wall, right? And so if we think about, do we really have to end relationships because we're so divided on politics, whatever the issue might be? One thing we might remind ourselves is, how far apart are we really? Right? I mean, aren't there a lot of things that we do agree on? Don't we both value family, freedom, country, shared history? We know each other. We care about each other. Are we really going to erect a wall between us? And so the first lesson is, for a wall to be a wall, it needs to be a substantial wall, right? How substantial is it really? When the sages need to actually measure out a wall, at least 10 handbreadths high and 4 handbreadths wide. All right, so a wall that's 4 handbreadths wide and 10 handbreadths high is a separate private domain. As I mentioned before, the top of the wall is its own domain. So we may not transfer food up to that domain or from it. If there was food on the wall, we can go ourselves up there. We can walk from a private domain into a public domain and vice versa. We can walk between domains. We just can't carry objects from one domain to another on Shabbos. So if there's that plate of food up there on the wall, we can go sit on the wall and eat it. Okay, what if the wall is not 4 handbreadths wide? What if the wall is only 3 handbreadths wide? Well, now, according to this definition, a substantial wall is 4 handbreadths wide or more and at least 10 handbreadths high. Well, now it doesn't meet those requirements. Now it's a thinner wall. It's only 3 handbreadths wide. So what have we got? Well, if it's less than 4 handbreadths wide, it's not its own separate domain. And the first ruling that the Gemara gives on this is, well, in that case, we may not move produce that happens to be on that wall at all, right? So if we have this situation and there's some food on that wall, but now that wall is less than 4 handbreadths wide, it's only a few handbreadths wide, say 2 handbreadths wide, right? So it doesn't count as its own domain. If it doesn't count as its own domain, well, then where is it? The top of that wall, where is it? It's in the airspace above these 2 courtyards, which we could say the courtyards themselves extend to the middle of the wall, right? The actual border, the edge between those 2 courtyards is in the middle of the wall. And therefore, that food that's on top of the wall is resting in 2 domains. The food is actually in both domains. So if we move that food at all, we're going to be making a little bit of a transfer from one domain to another. So the Gemara says, oh, you can't move that food at all. You can't touch it if it's sitting on a wall that's less than 4 handbreadths wide. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. If it's less than 4 handbreadths wide, well, then the wall is not substantial. If the wall is not substantial, this is all one courtyard. It's not divided, right? It looks like a wall. It looks like a pretty beefy wall. It doesn't look that different, certainly from my side or from your side. It doesn't look different than the 4 handbreadths thick wall, but it's only a 3 handbreadths thick wall, and therefore it's not a wall at all. This is really all one courtyard. We all must make a joint eruv together, and any food that happens to be sitting on the wall can absolutely be taken down and moved around the courtyards because it's just in one large courtyard, says Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbah says in the name of Rav Huna, who said in the name of Rav Nachman, that a wall between 2 courtyards on different levels. Okay, so let's get this figure here. And we actually have this situation exactly at our house. So there's a wall between us and our neighbor, and his yard is higher than our yard, right? So his yard is on a plane that's higher than our yard. So on our side of the wall seems taller because it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, let's say. But on his side, it's less than 10 handbreadths above the ground. So in that situation, there's a principle that the sages have called the principle of convenience. This is very nice, right? According to the principle of convenience, because that wall, let's say on my side, is more than 10 handbreadths high, so the top of that wall is not really useful to me because it's another domain. But on his side, since it's less than 10 handbreadths from the ground, the top is useful to him. He can use it because it's not a significant wall with respect to his yard, since it seems shorter because the ground on his side is higher up. So the sages say the top of the wall becomes permitted to him and prohibited to me. This is a general, why it's called the principle of convenience, right? If you've got something that is, potentially available to 2 parties, but for one person it's much more convenient than to the other, and meaning that the other is not really going to make use of it, and the first, it is convenient to him, he might use it, so then they assign all of it to him, right? He can use the top of the wall to rest objects on during Shabbos. I can't use the top of the wall because for me it's more than 10 handbreadths above the ground, and even though it is 4 handbreadths wide, it would be its own domain, and it would be separate domain from each of us, as we were talking about earlier. But because for him it's less than 10 handbreadths from the ground, what they do is they make the whole 4 handbreadths with the top of the wall part of his courtyard, not part of mine. This is not a law that affects property values and selling the property and who has a right to build or take down a wall. This is only for use on Shabbos. He can rest objects on top of that wall. I can't because it's too high off the ground on my side, but within a usable height on his side. And the same principle would apply for a ditch. If the ditch is on my side, there's a ditch at the bottom of the wall. We have a figure for that as well, right? So there's a ditch at the bottom of the wall. And so the ditch is going to be close to the ground on my side, but a long way down from the lawn on his side. So he's not going to use that ditch, but I might use that ditch. I might, store items there. It would be protected because they're at the base of the wall. So I might want to keep some stuff there or use it as storage. It becomes available to me on my side, but because it's so inconvenient to him to, reach all the way down to that ditch at the bottom of a wall that's 10 handbreadths high, so he wouldn't use it, so it becomes assigned to my side for use on Shabbos. Okay, and this is where the metaphorical level is going to apply even more. So now we've been talking about using a wall and how high the wall is and how thick the wall is and whether we want to put stuff on top of it or remove stuff that we happen to find on top of the wall. But if the wall is 10 handbreadths high or more and 4 handbreadths thick or more, it divides us. That's it. We have separate courtyards. We don't have the option to make a joint eruv if we wanted to. We can't join our courtyards so that we can carry things between the courtyards on Shabbos. Things that start in the house went out into the courtyard, and we don't have that option to transfer into the other courtyard on Shabbos. But can we make modifications to the wall so that it would become permitted to make that joint eruv? Specifically, what if we put a rock, a nice big rock, right next to the wall that would then function as a step up to the top of the wall? Now the wall is no longer 10 handbreadths above the ground because where that rock is, right at the base of the wall, and the rock has to be at least 4 handbreadths wide, the wall is no longer 10 handbreadths high. It's relative to the rock. It's less than that, 4, 5, 6 handbreadths, whatever it is. Creating that step effectively diminishes the height of the wall. So just taking one step up toward that wall that divides us actually makes it so that the wall is no longer a wall. Because the principle is, once you have access to the top of that wall for at least 4 handbreadths, the wall is no longer a wall. Now the whole top of the wall becomes accessible. It's as if the whole wall is diminished in height, and now the wall is no longer a wall. And in fact, we're going to need to make a joint eruv. It's like these two courtyards are one. Now Rav Yechiel, where is he? So Rav Yechiel, oh, and by the way, this is also going to work if we just carve out a little bit of the wall, right? If we take away some of the wall for at least 4 handbreadths, we don't have to diminish the wall everywhere, but if we diminish 4 handbreadths of it, again, relative to the ground, it's no longer 10 handbreadths high. We have access to the top of the wall. We could walk all along the top of the wall, and now it's like we don't have a wall anymore. What seemed like an impenetrable, insurmountable barrier between us, all we needed to do was take away a little bit from the top of the wall or add a little bit to the ground at the base of the wall, and suddenly it's like that whole wall can fall apart. When we're in an argument with somebody and we're just so far apart, and it feels like, we're going to split up, the friendship's going to end, the relationship's going to end because we're so divided. Just taking that little step back can do wonders. Now, Rav Yechiel says that we could even take a basin, right? So think of a bucket, right? That's at least 4 handbreadths wide, a good-sized bucket, turn it over, put it at the base of the wall, and then we could step up on that, and that diminishes the height of the wall, and it's like the whole wall goes away. Not so fast, says the Gemara. This principle that we're going to be quite lenient, right, in diminishing the wall. If we just diminish it in one section, it's as if we have access to the whole wall and over the wall and the other courtyard, and it's as if the wall isn't there anymore. Not so fast. We're not going to do that with simply overturning a bucket and putting it at the base of the wall. Why? Because a bucket is a vessel, and a vessel can be moved on Shabbos. It is not muktzah. Remember, we talked a lot about muktzah items when we were in Tractate Shabbos. What is muktzah? Muktzah is something that is really used only for work, for stuff during the week. And it has no real legitimate use on Shabbos. And so since we can't, to use it would be to risk getting involved into some kind of work, so we don't even touch it on Shabbos. But any kind of vessel that you can move things around and that you could put, liquids or foods into is not considered muktzah. So this bucket that we overturned, it's movable on Shabbos. There's nothing preventing us from moving it. And it's such an insubstantial object that it's not going to count as diminishing the wall. Not good enough. And the principle is anything that can be moved on Shabbos is not going to count as diminishing the wall. It has to have a little bit more permanence to it. So then the next suggestion is made, okay, well, we can work with Rav Yechiel's bucket for diminishing the wall if we just kind of, pile up some dirt around it so that it's, it's firm, it's in one place, there's dirt holding it down. Says the Gemara, no, that's not really enough. Because we have a principle, you can't pick a plant. You can't cut a plant on Shabbos. For instance, if you have radishes in the ground and you pick a radish out of the ground that was growing in the ground, or a carrot, right? And you just take it out of the ground, you rip it out, it's a root vegetable. You can't do that on Shabbos because that's the prohibited labor on Shabbos of harvesting. You can't harvest. But if you already pulled the radishes or carrots out of the ground during the week, and then you said to yourself, because you lived in ancient times and you don't have such fancy refrigerators and storage things like we do, you said to yourself, you know what? This radish will actually be fresher on Shabbos if I just store it in the ground. So you've already cut the roots, as it were. It's not gonna, you're not planting it, right? You already picked it. But then you're actually going to put it back in the ground simply for storage and just cover it a little bit with some dirt. So now, can you pick that already picked radish, but that was just stored in the ground? Can you take that out of the ground on Shabbos? Yes, you can. What about the fact that dirt, which is muktzah, right? You can't go scooping up dirt on Shabbos because dirt and sticks and stones are considered muktzah. We don't move them. We don't get involved with that because in a sense they're construction materials or gardening materials. So if you draw that radish out on Shabbos that you kind of reburied after you picked it during the week, you're going to move some of that dirt. But you're not moving the dirt in order to move the dirt. You're not moving the dirt because you're going to get involved in a planting or gardening project. You're only moving the dirt incidentally to what you really want, which is the radish. So the fact that some dirt got moved incidentally is not going to prohibit you from taking the radish out of the ground. That's a principle we already had in Tractate Shabbos. Likewise, this bucket that we overturned and we tried to make it firm by putting some dirt around it, well, we can pick up the bucket and we don't have to worry about moving the dirt. Therefore, it remains a very temporary type of structure. It's not a structure at all. It's just a bucket that we place there and piling up a little dirt around the outside. Not enough to make it have that permanent characteristic so that we could call it diminishing the wall so that the wall isn't there. In order for the wall to be diminished, if we're going to put a step up to diminish the height of the wall, it has to have some permanence to it, some reality, some significance to it. So if you were going to use a bucket for that purpose, you'd have to pile enough dirt on it, or concrete really, so that you would need tools to dislodge it. Since you wouldn't take tools to it on Shabbos, that's certainly prohibited. Digging, any kind of construction, etc., is prohibited on Shabbos. So then it would be prohibited to move such a bucket that was, installed in the ground so permanently. Since it's prohibited to move it, a bucket that was installed in that way would be considered to diminish the height of the wall, and then it would make the wall not a wall. And so if we're going to talk about it at that metaphoric level, right, that we're in such a fight with somebody that we can't talk to each other anymore, so we have to take a step toward the other person to diminish the wall between us. Yeah, it can't be like a totally half-hearted, yeah, okay, what? You want to talk to me, what? That is not taking a step. Right? It has to be a significant step, a real step to diminish the wall between the two courtyards. And I'm almost at the end, so if you have comments or questions, please be sure to put them in there now. And then if we were actually going to use stools, okay, they can be called a ladder, but when we're talking about an Egyptian ladder or a Tyrian ladder, and say an Egyptian ladder does not diminish the height of the wall, whereas a larger Tyrian ladder does effectively diminish the height of the wall. So what is an Egyptian ladder? An Egyptian ladder is basically a step stool. Right? So a step stool is something that you can move around on Shabbos. It's only 3 steps. You could put it at the base of the wall. You could take it away. It's not significant enough to be considered like it's diminishing the wall. Now, a larger ladder also is not muktzah. You can move a ladder around on Shabbos because it allows you to get to another part of your house. That's a permitted labor. Just because it's a ladder and sometimes used in construction doesn't mean that it has to be for construction. We may use ladders, so you might think that any kind of ladder is not significant enough, but a bigger ladder that's heavy, that people aren't going to go around moving on Shabbos, that will be enough to consider that the wall is diminished, and we could make an eruv based on that, a joint eruv between the two courtyards, because it diminishes the wall. If we have ladders on both sides of the wall, and now you could start to imagine a much taller wall, right? Like when you have a nice tall wall, like taller than the door, almost as high as the roof of a one-story house, how could that possibly, not be a wall? How could we think of diminishing such a wall so that these courtyards could be joined together? Well, if you have 2 ladders, one on each side, then it starts to become possible. You can imagine that this is a valid entrance. People are going to go up one ladder and down the other. And then the only conditions on those 2 ladders, right, is that they have to be close enough together so that it's like if you go up one, go down the other, and you don't have to go balancing on a thin wall to get from one ladder to the other. So the 2 ladders have to be within 3 handbreadths of each other. Or if the wall is thick, if it's a thick wall, like 4 handbreadths thick or more, then the ladders don't have to be close to each other. There just need to be 2 ladders because you could walk on that wall, right? Remember, as we said, that's a private domain up there. It's its own domain. It's comfortable enough to walk along that wall. So the ladders don't have to be close together because it's easy enough to go up one ladder, walk along the wall, and go down the other ladder. So positioning 2 real ladders, it's as if we've made an opening in the wall, and now those 2 courtyards could join. Would they have to join? I don't think so. I think that this is more like an opening between them. We're diminishing the wall enough so that we can join the courtyards, but I don't think that having those kind of ladders there, I'm not sure, but I don't think is going to require us to call this all one domain, and we wouldn't have the option of keeping the courtyard separate for the purposes of making eruv on Shabbos. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us see comments and questions. Yosef, is this talk about building walls above courtyards a certain height what contributed to the innovation of using phone poles and lines? Okay, so Yosef is talking about modern day community eruv, right? So a community eruv is making one enclosure around a whole region of the city. And it's a little bit different, Yosef, because the height doesn't matter. What we need there is cross beams and side posts. It's a network of side posts and cross beams, and those are not walls. Those are symbolic, right? You could obviously walk through them. There's nothing holding you back from walking under the symbolic eruv, which joins a neighborhood eruv, the symbolic partitions that surround a neighborhood eruv, which has to be a complete surrounding, a complete enclosure. Like, it's not going to keep people or animals out. This system of having fishing line, going from one light pole to another, or telephone poles, and then we have a symbolic side post at the base of those light poles or telephone poles. And really, that's that system of side posts and cross beams, symbolic in nature, which make a big community eruv. Here, where we're talking about the joining of courtyards, it's definitely less symbolic. As we see, I mean, there is some sense of it. There's a symbolic aspect to it that we could consider the wall is not a wall if it's just beneath a certain height. But the neighborhood eruv is a little bit different, sort of philosophy underpinning it. Sharon says, so a fence doesn't separate two courtyards. So a good fence does make good neighbors in this case. I think you're saying a good fence is one that doesn't separate them, right? A good fence that clearly shows, that that's your property, that's my property, but it's short enough or thin enough that we still can, go over it as if it's not there, and we do join, right? So all depending on how you're going to define good in that case with regard to the fence. And, says Sharon, in the case of uneven terrain and the wall is not consistent in height for its full length, where do you measure and which height is the official one? Sharon, now you're really sounding like a sage, like a Talmudist, right? Excellent question. I don't know. We haven't got to that yet, but it seems to me like you would need that 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths high along its whole length. Otherwise, you've got an area that's diminished in height, and that is what we've been saying. If you diminish an area, it's as if, you have access to the whole top of the wall, and now the wall is not a wall anymore. So very good point. Tom, maybe you move the dirt in an unusual way, right? So this is the idea that you can't move dirt in the usual way because dirt is muktzah, but that's exactly right. When you pick the radish during the week, then you reburied it just so that it would stay fresh. It seems to you it's going to stay fresher in the ground. Then when you take the radish out, some dirt is going to fall off the radish naturally, but that's not the way that you normally move dirt, right? Normally you move dirt with some kind of shovel, some kind of garden tools, not with the back of a radish, right? So it is, and as we've seen, when you want to move a muktzah item, you want to do that in an unusual way. So for example, on Shabbos, somebody left a pen on the dinner table, right? So a pen is definitely muktzah on Shabbos because writing is prohibited on Shabbos. So now there's that pen on the table. We don't want the pen on the table during our Shabbos dinner. So we want to move that pen. Because it's muktzah, we want to indicate that we know we're not supposed to be touching the pen, but that it's permitted to move the pen because we want its place, right? We don't need the pen for something. We just want its place, meaning we don't want it on the table. We want the Shabbos table to be penless, as it were. So you could pick up the pen kind of like that. That's what I do. I use my thumb and my pinky. Sort of if anyone is watching, they would get that I'm picking it up in an unusual manner, as Tom mentions. And Jason says, how do you know a root didn't somehow grow back beforehand? You guys are really good. So Jason, I don't cover everything that's in our daf, but since you ask, here it is, and there is no concern when you do this. Didn't we learn in a Mishna? With regard to one who buries a turnip or a radish in the ground beneath a vine for safekeeping during the week, when some of the leaves of the turnip or radish are showing, right, so you know where it is, so you can pick it back out, he need not be concerned due to diverse kinds, as if he planted the radish among other vegetables, and you can't or let's say in a vineyard, you can't plant vegetables among grapevines. That's the prohibition of planting diverse kinds near each other. And there is no concern, and he did not intend to commit an act of planting, that it was not considered planting. He need not be concerned about tithes. In other words, we're not going to be concerned that when he put the radish back in the ground, that it might have actually grown a little bit. And if it grew a little bit before we take it back out of the ground, maybe we need to tithe that growth. Presumably when we pick the vegetable during the week, if we picked enough vegetables that we need to tithe them, we would have set aside the tithe. If we put some back in the ground, what if they grew a little bit? And so there's actually more produce now. Do we need to tithe that extra growth? No, we're not concerned about that. Nor are we concerned with the prohibition against working the land during the sabbatical year, right? Like maybe we're storing these turnips in the ground and it's the year of the Shemitah. Every 7th year in ancient Israel, the farmers would not plant at all. That's a commandment in the Torah that you don't work the land in the 7th year. But this is not considered working the land. We're just using the land for storage. We're not planting and harvesting. Excuse me. And therefore, the trumpet radish may be taken from the ground on Shabbos. So in other words, because we're not concerned about tithing, we're not concerned that the plant somehow rooted again in that short amount of time. We wouldn't do this for a lot of time, right? I mean, if you've already picked the radish and then you put it back in the ground, it's not going to keep so long. And the sages have said we're not concerned. And this is actually a theme that we've been seeing, just like Rabbi Yochanan was not concerned about taking stuff on and off that wall if it's less than 4 tefachim wide, 4 handbreadths wide. There are certain things that we could come up with a concern that people might violate and, in kind of unusual circumstances. But the rabbis, the sages are very aware that they are making decrees to protect people from coming to violate Torah prohibitions. But they don't want to over-decree, nor do they want to issue further decrees to keep people from violating their own rabbinic decrees, right? They don't want to over-legislate. So even though they're really trying to think of all the different ways that people can go wrong, just because they can think of something that could happen doesn't mean that it should rise to the level of needing a law passed to protect the people from coming to make that transgression. And Yosef Shum says, can we find these drawings on the AT website? That's a pretty good idea. The problem is, I don't have publishing rights to this book. And the book itself is called, it doesn't have an English name. I learned about it from Abish Rand, who substituted for me when I was away for a week a couple months ago. Where is this? The name of the book, why can't I can't, stop. There it is. The name of the book is Hamahor Hamevohar. On Eruvin, Hamahor Hamevohar. I'll put that in the comments, but Hamahor, Hamevohar. And it has all these wonderful illustrations in them. And I asked Abish about it. He's like, do you have the whole set of Talmud for that? With all these drawings for every tractate? And he said, no, it's just for Eruvin, because Eruvin is so difficult. And it's often so useful to have these kinds of illustrations when we're in this tractate in particular. So I'm a little reticent to sort of publish it since I don't have a right to do that. But, just to illustrate as we're teaching a class, that seems to be okay. But I think it is online. You can find it online. I found it online. All right. So if you just Google that, and I'll put the name in the comments, you should be able to find it. That's what I've got for us today. May we all continue to grow in wisdom every day, both about the physical, practical barriers between us and our neighbors, and also about those metaphoric barriers between us and people we care about, and how useful it is, and how quickly we can diminish those walls between us if we will take a significant step to diminish that wall. All the best.